I mean, I've dived really all over the world in some of the best places in the world, and the place I still recommend is always the Red Sea in Egypt.
Wow.
Yeah. So I took off when I was 18 and traveled for a year and a half, and basically it kind of changed the way I looked at things. I started realizing I could really have a good fun thing on 10 bucks a day, if you will, and that really hasn't changed. I've always been a budget traveler, and yeah, I went to Asia, and Asia changes your life. It was the 80s, it was the time of Koh Samui was opening up, and it was paradise. And I started diving a lot in the 90s. I had a business for a couple of years in the States, and then in the end of 93, 92, I took off to find some land. I wanted to start a hotel, traveled for a few years, and while I was doing it, I realized that diving was a good way that you can work anywhere. And it just became a drug. I'm addicted, so everywhere I go, it's always warm tropical countries most of the time. If you're a diver, you've been here in the Red Sea for years, and I mean, turned professional in 95, so but before that, I've been diving for 40 years now. For many, many years, I tried to get to the Red Sea, but I was in other countries diving, and then 98, I finally got here. So. And I worked at a beer hotel for the first place. I was quite the muppet when I first got here, and I thought Sharm el-Sheikh was, I went down and I got a job at a beer hotel. It was the first place I went to, and about 2 weeks later, someone at the shop said, "Come on, we go to Nama Bay." And I said, "What's Nama Bay?" And he said, "That's where all the dive shops are." So, and that year I started working at Sinai Divers.
When and where was your first dive?
First dive was in maybe Canada, but this was years and years ago, but I grew up and I learned in California.
Okay.
And
so your first dive was in Canada?
In Canada.
How was it cold? How was it?
Cold, very cold. Back then wetsuits were a lot different, so it was just, it was a lot of 7mm wetsuits, and it was a competition. My dad and my brother are both divers, and it was a competition on who came up with the most air. And actually, I almost stopped diving completely because I always got headaches because I was holding my breath, not realizing that if you hold your breath, it causes you to breathe more.
But you won the competition?
No, I didn't win the competition. I lost the competition and I got a headache.
Okay.
And then what happened after Canada and California? Like, how did you realize that's what you want to do? Or is it something you realized that you want to do?
As I said, I think when you start traveling, you realize that you have to make money somehow. Most people either, let's say they go out for a year and they make money, and then they go back to their home and they work again and they go out. And I realized I didn't want to go out or go back to work. For a couple of years, I tried not going back. And then diving is really, it's one of the best jobs out there. Languages are key, obviously. I think you know that. And I started in Central America, and I spent a couple of years in Central America, and then I moved back to Asia. I was in the Philippines, I was in Fiji, New Guinea, Indonesia, any place that you can dive, I was trying to explore.
And would you say out of all these places you dived, is the Red Sea one of the best? Where would you list it on your top 5?
Red Sea's up there, for sure. I think right now, Red Sea is probably still has some of the best visibility. The color, the blue, the color of the water here. The corals, the hard corals, the soft corals are fantastic. Indonesia these days, I think, is some of the best accessible diving in the world. But accessible meaning that it doesn't take long. I mean, maybe I should say the Red Sea is some of the best, but Indonesia, it takes a lot of going out. I mean, really hard travel to get there. So. And it takes time, so I think I've done 9, 10, 2 to 4 month trips into Indonesia just for diving.
And diving in Sharm when you came here in 98, could you go into a little bit detail of how that is? Because I know from listening to stories from you how incredible it sounds and how it was just a different world, but most people don't know what was happening in Sharm during that time.
Yeah, I think that you know, a lot of the differences, maybe I should say the differences I see, for example, there used to be a lot more nudibranchs. Now, for example, though, you get whale sharks a lot more. So in the last couple of years, it's been heavy amounts of whale sharks here up until December. Even we had one, a couple of weeks ago, which was very nice. I know I missed it, sorry. But back then, for example, in the late 90s and before that, you could go onto Ras Mohammed and Shark Reef, and you'd have what's called a shoal of barracuda. So you have 1,000 barracuda, you have silky sharks that are feeding on the barracuda. You could go out in the blue and watch them go up and take barracuda.
If you could go into a little bit on how you got into Sinai Divers and what it was like, because you guys were just legends back then. You guys are legends till now in the diving community. What was it like back then? Tell us a little bit about how life was working in one of the oldest and most biggest diving centers at the time.
For me, I got really lucky. There's a guy named Thomas Ashbacher who is a good friend, or still a friend, and he gave me the chance that got me in to Sinai Divers. He sort of said, "Hey, would you do one DSD?" And that got me in. And back then, you really had to go back to the shops all the time to check if there was work, and he let me in. And then I got work guiding. But for the first year, I guided what many people know as Gazala 4. It was called the Canoe. And it was a very small boat, and no sun, no shade whatsoever. And yeah, we just had everybody was just addicted to diving. I mean, back then it was 3 dives as much as possible on air. You worked for 20 days basically in a row, and then you took 2 days off and did it again. And if you didn't work, you didn't get paid, but nobody cared because it was just so good to dive here. And you know, it's funny, I mean, you talk about Sinai Divers, but if you look in my friend base, I think 50% of them are all from diving. And the Sinai Divers family is a huge thing. If you go back on, for example, Facebook, I have probably 45 connections that are still all of us still keeping together. We all keep in touch still. We're all going out. I saw a lot of them this summer again. I was in Switzerland and Germany, went to see friends, and it's just been a really, really cool family to be a part of. I mean, we were just, we did kind of, the attraction of what it was years ago, and it's changed a little bit in that sense, is basically if you were a dive guide, you got your boat and you did whatever you wanted. So you picked your site, and the boat captains were very open. As long as you said, "Hey, I'm going to come up here," and you did, that you could do just any kind of diving you wanted. And we didn't break any of the rules, not too often, but it takes a lot of you know, it takes experience to figure out how to teach. Sometimes we all teach the same thing at PADI or SSI, right? As long as you go through the requirements, but there's times when you really know, like, hey, that person did this, and you know how to counteract it. I don't think people realize how hard it is, for example, to take 10 people into a current without worrying about them. And you know, I learned the best education for diving I ever got was in the Red Sea. And I think I tell people, and I sell people on the Red Sea, you can take a PADI course anywhere, but in terms of the conditions and the fish life and the quality of the lifestyle, Egypt is it.
Could you go a little bit into detail about how life was in Nama Bay? Because that's where Sinai Divers was. It was one of the pioneer diving centers there at the time, for those that don't know. But now it's populated with restaurants and hotels and things like that. But when you came here, it was just camps, right? Just tents.
No.
It was already.
No, it's already exactly. I mean, when I came, we started off in the Gazala Hotel one, and nothing's changed. Maybe the difference is that, for example, 30 years ago, maybe there was only 30 people. In the high season, in the 90s, there was, I think Sinai Divers was putting out 15 boats a day. So you're looking at 150 divers, and everyone would come back and have a beer. It was a huge social thing. Yeah, it was a really, really good time. I think most of the people that look back on those times, it was some of the best times of their lives.
And how was it in Hadaba? Is that where you lived, right?
I lived in Hadaba for a couple. It's funny, as I walk around here, I see about 8 different places I've lived in. A lot of people lived in Hainur. A lot of people lived in Roissat when, and it used to be like, you know, that they would pick you up. So we had a car. I lived at least 3 or 4 seasons in High Noor, and here as well. It was a lot more expensive back then. So there's a house where Antonio is living that maybe now is $200 or $300, and back then it was $700-800. But the money you made back then was really, really good. The lifestyle has gone up drastically here. There's nothing you can't get anymore here.
And why would you say that the lifestyle is so improved in Sharm el-Sheikh? I mean, it brings you back almost.
Well, for example, just the number of grocery stores. I mean, it used to be that you couldn't get good coffee. Most people, if you have friends coming from Europe, it's like, what can I bring you? Bring coffee, bring bacon, bring lots of stuff that, you know, they never checked anything back then in the luggage.
You told me you're living 4 months a year, something like that, in Sharm?
4 months. Usually when I come the last couple of times have been 2 to 3 months. The thing about it is I know that in the past, if I came in September, October, it's the high season. Normally I do a warm winter, I'm in India or Thailand or Indonesia, but again, you can't go anywhere in the world right now. So if I stay here for a year or 2, then so be it. I mean,
you've got an amazing view over there.
Yeah,
so
I'm very happy about that.
You told me you've been living in a lot. Sorry, please.
But I think in the summer it's going to be really hot in this house. I think that sun's going to go straight through there. We'll see what happens.
It's going to be hot, but this is a view that many of our viewers.
Would you mind, Andy, like telling the people like what that is?
It's the Ras Mohammed National Park.
Over there.
Yeah. And going all the way out is the very southern tip of it. So this is where Shark Observatory and Shark Reef are.
Which are one of the best diving sites in the world.
In the world, for sure.
Incredible.
Do you think it's too hard now for people to become instructors and to live the lifestyle than it was when you were here or when you started out?
No, I think it's easier now. The biggest thing is that you can, you know, if you get your training in Egypt, you learn to really dive in usually with bigger groups. So, for example, when I first went to Asia after being here, they went and asked me like, "Hey, can you handle 4 people underwater?" And you just kind of laugh at them. He's had it as well. It's like 4 people. Come on, I mean, can I close my eyes and put my hands behind my back? You know, because and I'm talking about Thailand. If you go to Indonesia, you have some very big currents. But what you learn here to do is to take 8 or 10 people into big currents, and it's and to come up alive. For example, I think the scariest dive that I ever had was in Indonesia, in a place called Batu Bulong, which is in Komodo, and myself and one other friend who has a couple dive shops there. Basically, we almost died, and the current was too strong. It was a big, huge down current, and we climbed the reef to come back up. So
it's purely the current.
Yeah, according to the dive guide later on, and we were kind of set up, he figured there was 10 knots of down current. And it was massive. You just, the bubbles, you went out the mouth and they went straight down. And when we went into the water, my mask, I don't remember the whole thing, the current was so strong that it free flew the regulator, and the other guy lost the mask. It just blew to the side, and we put it on. And when you're talking, you can talk underwater with your eyes, and we both sort of said, should we continue? And we said, yeah, let's go for it. And we were kind of, I can't explain it. We were, the dive guide, we were watching him, and he jumped in the water and he held on to something, and then he let go and he tumbled and he went down deeper and he held on to something, and that's how we went down. And again, the question was whether or not we should end the dive, but we didn't know how deep it was, and we said, yeah, we go for it. And we ended up at about 40 meters, which wasn't a big thing, but when we tried to go up, we really couldn't go up. Even if you fully inflated, you couldn't come up, so we climbed. And for me, I blew my tank in 32 minutes.
Which for you is...
It was quick.
It is very quick.
Close shark encounters, I had some, but all in Indonesia.
Okay.
So...
so you would say the Red Sea is pretty safe, no?
I think all diving is safe. I mean, it's a religious experience to go in amongst a huge thing of sharks. It really is. So.
Sorry, I like religious experiences.
Yeah.
One thing I really like to hear about is the thistlegorm back in the day.
Yeah, I don't know.
Was that something like you did quite often back then?
I didn't do it enough because I bent myself on the thistlegorm.
Would you go into that? Because that sounds pretty scary for most people, and you speak about it very casually. But
No,
if you
I
could
think-
explain what getting bent is and how many times it's happened to
you don't
you.
know what it is. So I have a multi-use card going into the decompression chambers in quite a few countries, and the thistlegorm back then was a huge money maker. So it used to be that we got, I think it was $35 a day, and you could get extra for if you did the third dives. And the thistlegorm was always a $200 day because you got extra money, but the problem was you were on air. So you went and set a deep rope, and then you went for a dive, small surface interval, set another rope, or do another dive. Normally on the end of the second dive you would come up and untie the rope, and then a lot of times you had a lot of deco on you. You'd send everybody up, and then you'd basically float through the Suez with the safety sausage, SMB, and as soon as your deco was done, then you'd come up, and then you'd do a third dive on the way back somewhere, usually at the Mushroom. And yeah, there was a lot more parts to the ship. You know, the motorcycle still had handlebars. It was just a fabulous time. But in terms of other people, I did it hardly at all compared to others. I know people, you know, hundreds of times. But it was a big money maker. But if you bend yourself, then you're out of the water for 6 weeks, so there's no money anyhow.
And when was the first time you got bent in Sharm el Sheikh?
Don't forget there are people who
First
don't know
year
what
I
that
was
is.
here. I was, but again, the thing about decompression sickness is I had some symptoms. I don't know if I went in and Dr. Adel, you know, the questions they ask you, and I think I failed some tests, so they put me inside.
Would you be willing just to go into like a very brief description of what decompression sickness is? Just a real quick one?
Sure. So decompression sickness happens usually when you have too much nitrogen in your body. Basically, the bodies that are normally too small, they become too big and they trap. Yeah. Normally they trap in your joints, and for me, there's a couple different ways. You can have a mild case. You can have, for example, a skin rash, which is much more common, or you can lose the feeling in your arm. I lost my left arm on mine, and it was basically for too many ups and downs, and mine was on the thistlegorm. And then what you do is basically you go into a chamber, you recompress the bubbles, and the bubbles that are too big, you go down and you shrink them down long enough or small enough that they come out, and you come back and you're basically ready to dive again.
And your first time getting bent was on the thistlegorm?
No, the first time was in Fiji.
In Fiji, but the first time in the Red Sea was on the thistlegorm.
No, I've done a couple trips. The thing about, again, the first one that I'm sure of was the thistlegorm. But I also did another treatment before that in my first year here because I had some of the signs and symptoms as well. But maybe I didn't need to. I'm not really sure. But when Dr. Adel, who is obviously very professional, says we should put you in, then you should. And the chamber is something. Back then, I was also a tender for people. A tender is someone. So based on languages, when you go into the chamber, you're not supposed to go in alone. So you're basically sort of a modified nurse, and so. You could also go in as a tender, so I've done, 28 hours inside the chamber.
Why do you think he's thinking that it was better back in your days while you're saying actually...
Because we tell stories back then. I mean, we did a lot of, for example, we had depth limitations. We didn't have as many depth limitations. It used to be 40 meters, and we used to do we used to go shopping on Jackson Reef. We'd go down and pick things up down in deep. And back then, as long as you did it properly, it wasn't a big problem. Now, like when I first started here, there was no color rings on any of the tanks. So you don't know this, but for example, Sinai Divers had a green ring on the tanks. Ocean College had a gold ring, and Camel, I think, had an orange or something like that. So if you were deep diving maybe beyond what you were supposed to do, someone would look down and they'd say, oh, look, a Sinai Divers person is down inside the canyon, for example.
They could tell by the color on the tank.
They could tell by the color on the tank. And this, so back in the later 90s, yeah, if you really wanted to do something a little bit crazy, maybe you found a tank that hadn't been painted yet. And yeah, it was a lot more dangerous as well. Now you have nitrox, and for me, it's actually much safer. I would much rather dive on nitrox. I'm pretty old for diving as well, and to do three dives a day on air, I would last 4 or 5 days before I had to take days off, and now I can go 10. It's not a problem, inshallah.
At this point in the conversation with Andy, we're discussing how you can find experienced instructors and well-reputable diving centers in the area. But thanks to the wind, most of that couldn't be recorded. Pretty much in short, make sure you do your research before coming diving, and make sure you have trust in the instructor that you're with.
I think in terms of advice here, anytime you go places where you have a well-known center here, someone that's been around for a while, that you have guides that speak your own language if possible, and maybe you can even ask them, you can go in beforehand and say, tell me about your people. I mean, you don't know anything about the equipment or anything, but it's really nice if someone, for example, there's a guy named Nick Brown. He's been here forever. He's at UNAS. He's been here since the 90s as well. He knows every dive site, and he doesn't get tired of it. And if you can find guides like that really know what they're talking about, and then you're going to have a much better experience and much better diving.
So finding somebody who's passionate about what he does,
and a little bit crazy, and has been here for a while. There's ways to dive these sites that most people don't think about. So, for example, even when if you go out to Shark and Yolanda, a lot of people, they just stick to the reef. Well, why not go out in the blue? Because that's where you might catch something. That's where you're going to get big fish maybe coming to see you. Because sharks, when a hammerhead comes up to you, all they're doing is seeing is who's in my backyard. So if you go in, make a few signals, and maybe they come, but you tell the people in advance, say, listen, it's maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but at least you give it a try, and most people don't even know how to do it. So.
And what about those people who dream of coming here, maybe becoming dive masters?
Do it. It's the best place in the world to learn. You have a really good long season from April until November. Even December it was still diveable. We had whale sharks in December still. You have fantastic conditions for learning in currents. You can go to dive sites that have 4 or 5 different currents on them in the same dive site. The soft corals are world class still. The thistlegorm is there. So in terms of learning, I mean, I've dived really all over the world in some of the best places in the world, and the place I still recommend is always the Red Sea in Egypt.
Wow.
Yeah. Always.
That was beautiful, especially with that sunset on the back. Because you forgot to mention that you get the sunset as well, and this balcony, and that's part of the experience.
It is.
Thank you very much.
No problem, anytime.
Thank you.
You again.
Is that